From making headlines for a new scandal every week to dismissing living legends like they're nothing, Dana White has done it all. Recently, though, he decided to come out and talk about why he thinks Fedor should have hung up the gloves a long time ago. Trust me, Fedor probably wasn't happy after hearing about this. Now, Fedor Emelianenko is often regarded as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. The man has managed to achieve heights in the sport of MMA that most of us can only dream of.
I'd say we're not taking it away from Fedor. Oh my God!
That's beautiful. He's got it.
Cabrini Green. Emelianenko hit him with a right hand. Oh no! Squared right on the chin, knocked it right down. Quick. That's one of the quickest left hands I think I've ever seen thrown by Fedor.
And Fedor Emelianenko, an absolute machine. A barrage.
That's it.
I think it's safe to say that this is one dude you wouldn't want to cross. However, despite being held on such a pedestal by the MMA world, there's one man who doesn't want to buy into the hype. Of course, I'm talking about none other than Dana White. You know, I'm beginning to notice somewhat of a trend. These days, whenever there's a controversy related to MMA, Dana is usually involved in one way or another. This time, though, he outright dissed one of the best fighters of all time in the worst way possible. In case you're wondering what was said, well, he blurted out the fact that, in his opinion, Fedor should have retired from the sport a long time ago. I know, seeing everything he's managed to achieve, you'd think that's a preposterous thing to consider. That said, if you hear Dana out, you'll begin to see why he said what he said. Although, I'll warn you, it doesn't get any less harsh. So, Fedor, who's now 46, finally decided to retire from the sport he loves. It's just that his last fight, and the way it ended up going for him, is probably not the best way to finish off such a legendary career. See, Fedor's last fight was against the current Bellator heavyweight champion, Ryan Bader. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be locked in a room with that guy if he's angry.
Competing for the first time at heavyweight. He's already dropped the ball with the left hand.
Bader's right arm, look what it's doing with the right hand of Mitrione. Often has he done that in his life. This is where we're
of the heavyweight world Grand Prix, Ryan Bader.
Anyways, it's obvious that Bader was destined to win this match. He had every advantage known to man coming into this fight. And just as predicted, he ended up knocking Fedor out in the first round.
a little bit of half hitch, that's his fate. And watch for that right. Oh, it's gonna be over.
Big shot. And it's all over. Just like that. Ryan Bader knocks out Fedor Emelianenko.
It's losses like these that caused Dana White to voice his opinion on Fedor's retirement. He believes that Fedor pushed himself a little too far and didn't end up doing much except embarrassing himself. The real question here, however, is whether or not Dana is right about this. Spoiler alert, it's both a yes and a no. Alright, look, it's no secret that Fedor has fallen off. There was a time when there wasn't a fighter alive who could step up to this guy. But like all things, as time went by, Fedor became less and less lethal. Finally, by the time he made it all the way here, well, let's just say his IQ didn't match up with his skills. At least, that was how he performed in his final fight. Dana talked about how Fedor was always a good fighter, but never a great one. One of the reasons he said that was because of how long Fedor allowed his career to continue. There seems to be a popular opinion floating around that he should have gone out on top. Instead, he kept coming back, and well, we all know how that ended. Still, there were moments where you could see the GOAT inside this guy coming out. So, in a way, Dana was right about the whole thing, but then he was wrong at the same time too. Besides, there was a snide comment that White passed later on in the interview that kinda sealed the deal. In case you're confused, I'm talking about the Dan Henderson comment. Fedor has had a few moments in his career where he hasn't performed up to par. Then, there have been some moments that were just outright embarrassing. One of those moments was a memory that I'm pretty sure he'd rather forget. I'm talking about none other than the one time he got knocked out by a middleweight fighter.
The conclusion of the heavyweight world Grand Prix, tonight's main event will be 5 5-minute rounds for the Bellator heavyweight world championship. By knockout, he is the winner of the heavyweight world Grand Prix, and now the new Bellator heavyweight world champion, Ryan Bader.
His wife Daisy, his entire family,
In my opinion, Henderson is the star of the show here. Who would have thought Dan had it in him? If the incident itself wasn't embarrassing enough, the fact that Dana brought it back up again in front of reporters just made it worse. Still, you have to give credit where credit is due. A few messed up moments don't define an entire career. Just like he's got a few mess ups, he also has a large number of moments in his career where he's made everyone proud. Of course, there's no doubting the fact that his achievements far outweigh his shortcomings. Still though, a heavyweight like Fedor getting knocked out by a middleweight is pretty comical to say the least. Anyways, regardless of how his career ended, you have to wonder why Fedor never competed in the UFC. According to Dana, negotiations broke down. So it's not like these guys didn't try to get Fedor into the UFC, it's just that Fedor himself never really showed any interest. The two parties sat down for negotiations. That said, even after repeated attempts to get Fedor comfortable with the idea of joining the UFC, it was to no end. A lot of people began to think that Dana had a personal issue with Emelianenko, which caused him to stay away from the UFC. But according to the UFC boss, that couldn't be further from the truth. He went on to talk about how he has absolutely no issues with Fedor. He genuinely wanted him to come and fight in the UFC. At least that way, he could have gone up against the best of the best and would have truly tested his skills. However, as unfortunate as it is, things didn't end up working out. Maybe in some other universe, Fedor did end up in the UFC. He might even have gone on to win the heavyweight champion. I guess we'll never know. Besides, there's another way more important question that needs to be answered, and that's whether Fedor was ever good enough to be considered one of the GOATs. This one's a tough one to answer. There were a lot of things that Fedor managed to achieve throughout his career that for a lot of people made him one of the best heavyweights of all time. But on the flip side, there were also a ton of moments where he messed up big time and ended up for the other half of the MMA community as just another washed up heavyweight. If you ask me, this dude is a GOAT in my book. He's just accomplished too many things to not count him in. As I mentioned before, if by some miracle Fedor had ended up on the UFC roster, there's a good chance he would have cleaned up the entire heavyweight lineup. As far as Dana is concerned, to me, it seems like he's just being petty. It's as if he's still mad about the fact that Fedor turned his offer down and stuck with Bellator. You also have to remember the fact that Emelianenko is also a big reason why Bellator grew in popularity in the way that it did. In some ways, you could even say that Fedor was the John Jones of Bellator. That's not praising that you take lightly. Whatever Dana might say, one thing's for sure, and that's the fact that Fedor was and always will be one of the best to have ever done it. Sure, he might not have had the chance to go up against fighters from the UFC, but he did end up making a name for himself despite fighting under an organization that wasn't nearly as famous as the former. And that, folks, was everything that Dana White said about Fedor Emelianenko's retirement.